Welcome this morning. This is a very exciting moment for me. In fact, the idea for this symposium came up a few years ago when Deborah Dashmur, who was the let me introduce myself first. I'm Shachar Pinsker. I am associate professor here at the Near Eastern Studies Department and Judaic Studies, and I am very excited about the symposium this morning. And it really started a few years ago when Deborah Dashmur was the director of the Frankel Center, sat together with Maya Barzilai, my colleague who is going to be here in a few minutes. We thought about an idea for a symposium for the Weizneck symposium. The Weizneck family gave money to have a few events around Israel and Israeli culture, and we thought that the topic of multilingualism in Israeli literature and culture is a very important one that did not receive a lot of attention, but is now receiving a lot of attention and becoming very important. And we thought that we're going to do it at some point, and this is the point. This year, when we have the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies, where many of the fellows are here around the table and also will present. The topic of the theme of this year is Israeli histories, cultures and societies. And it emerged, not so surprising to me, that the topic of multilingualism in Israel is a very important one. So this was a natural fit to do it this year. So I want to thank the Weizneck family, first of all, for enabling us to have this symposium, to Jeff Weidlinger, the director of the Frankel Center, who is also going to come here shortly after his teaching, to the people in the office, especially Sherry Thompson, Stacy Eckert, and Kelsey Robinet for organizing. But thank you most of all to all the participants and the speakers and the respondents and the chairs. We were very fortunate actually to have people coming all the way from Bishkek and from Oxford, all the way to Michigan and Ohio and everything in between. And in fact, many people wanted to come and were not able to come. So that's, in fact, also we are being recorded today because eventually there's a lot of interest in the topic of the symposium outside Michigan, and I am certain that this is going to be a very productive and fruitful symposium that is really going to move the topic that we are discussing today forward. So I'm very much looking forward to it, and we're going to move directly to the first session, and I'm going to turn the microphone to Liora Halperin, who is going to be the chair and the respondent.
I don't know. Thank you. Great. Hi, everyone. Is this working? Okay, great. Well, thank you all for coming to this first session. I'm really pleased to introduce the participants. I will present them just before each presentation, and then I'll time everyone to keep everyone to their 20 minutes. And then I'll give some response afterwards. So our first presenter is Shachar Pinsker from here at the University of Michigan. Shachar is an associate professor of Near Eastern Studies and Judaic Studies. He's also the head fellow in the Frankel Institute session this year. He is finished nearly with his next book, which is going to be called A Rich Brew, Urban Cafes and Modern Jewish Culture, which will come out with NYU Press. He's also has a forthcoming collection of Yiddish Israeli stories in Hebrew translation that's being published in Israel. And today he'll be speaking about between Loshen Mame Kodesh and the Father Tongue, Israeli-Yiddish encounters. Shachar.
Thank you. Okay, so moving now from sharing to presenting. Just a second here. You see? Okay. Great. So thank you very much, Liora. And before I start, I just want to say that as I was preparing this talk and choosing among the materials, it became suddenly clear that I'm talking here about two Avroms, two Abrahams, and two Yossels. And in fact, when I started thinking about this project and working on it many years ago, all these four people that I'm talking about were alive, and unfortunately, they are all dead now. This is a generation of people who are gone, and one of them, Yossel Bergner, just died. The artist Yossel Bergner just died a month ago, so I want to dedicate the talk to his memory. Okay. So, the place of Yiddish in Israeli literature and culture is a topic that only recently began to receive scholarly attention. It includes a large corpus of literature written in Yiddish from the establishment of Israel until today, as well as many translations from Yiddish into Hebrew. There is also a significant body of literature created in Hebrew in which Yiddish plays an explicit or implicit role. My talk focuses on a few Yiddish works by poets, writers, and artists who arrived in Israel around 1948. In these works, Yiddish is invoked in a way that brings to mind what Lita Levy, who is sitting somewhere here, called meta-language, hyper-awareness of language, of its social and cultural meaning. Due to the historical circumstances of Yiddish after the Holocaust, invoking it involves questions about what Jeffrey Chandler identified as post-vernacular culture, a situation in which symbolic significance is carried by the language apart from the semantic content of utterances. Not surprisingly, Israeli Yiddish writers and artists were preoccupied with the relationship between Yiddish and Hebrew, and dealt with images of Yiddish as Mameloshen, mother tongue, in the context of what Yasmin Yildiz has termed the linguistic family romance. So, where shall I begin? Shall I start from the beginning? Soll ich anheben von Honheib? This is a quote, a question asked by the speaker of Avrom Sutzkever's poem, Yiddish, from 1948, and the poem in Yiddish and in English translation by Benjamin and Barbara Arshava on the slide. The poem appeared in the first book that Sutzkever published after he arrived in Israel, in Feuerwogen, in the Chariot of Fire from 1952. Although this question seems to be rhetorical, it opens a host of other questions. When and where is the beginning? The beginning of what? Indeed, this is a poem full of questions, written in a tense dialogue with someone else, an addressee, an other. Who is it? Since Sutzkever's book is about places and people in Israel, it is likely that the addressee here is an Israeli, a Hebrew speaker, perhaps an established Hebrew poet who poses to a Yiddish poet newly arrived in the country difficult questions of why. Why writing Yiddish? Why Yiddish? Why in Israel? Is there any future for Yiddish in Israel? Sutzkever, a Holocaust survivor who arrived in Tel Aviv in 1947, has undergone the traumatic experience of living near death, of being uprooted and facing the task of finding a new identity in what was essentially a foreign country. There is the crucial dimension of his identity as a poet in an environment where he became, as he expressed it in another poem, naketer, naked. In his Israeli poetry, Sutzkever creates a new network of images derived from the landscape of Israel-Palestine and the Bible. So when the speaker poet, I go back to the poem, when the speaker poet attempts to answer the question, shall I start from the beginning? He begins with, surprise, surprise, Genesis. But he insists on using the Yiddish word honheib and not bereshit, or honhoib, the Yiddish word. This is significant because honheib was widely used in early 20th century as a title for Yiddish modernist journals, books, and publishing houses. In August 1928, a group of writers published Onheib, the first Palestinian collection of Yiddish literature, And the poet-translator Yehoash used the same spelling, onheib, to begin his Yiddish translation of the Bible from the same time. This reminds readers that both Israel-Palestine and the Bible have been experienced already by many people in Yiddish, as well as the existence of a significant body of Palestinian literature in Yiddish before 1948. In light of this, it is not surprising that the poem moves not to the biblical Adam, the beginning, but to Abraham, the father of the nation, which is also the poet's namesake. When God commands Abraham, Lech lecha me'artzecha, get thee out of thy country, your homeland, and your father's house, he asks him to make a clear break with the past and a fresh start in a new land. According to the Midrash to which the poem alludes, Abraham not only crosses the Jordan and leaves his father's house behind him, but also smashes the idols, not merely immigrating, but destroying his father's past. Thus, I understand the line, Soll ich wie Avrom, ois Bruderschaft, zehaken alle Getzen, shall I, like Abraham, out of brotherhood, smash all the idols, as referring to the Israeli ideology of negation of exile, cutting off relations with the Jewish diaspora, and ostensibly with Yiddish, the Ashkenazic diasporic language, which is implicitly figured here as a father tongue. So, is Yiddish a getz, an idol, that one needs to smash in order to become an Israeli? This rhetorical question shows Sutzkever's defiance of monolingualism as a prerogative of Israeli cultural identity. It continues in the following line, Shall I let myself be translated alive? Soll ich sich a lebendigen Losen übersetzen? This question is surprising because of the implied equation of translation with death. Why? What is so wrong with being translated and thus being read by more people? For Sutzkever in 1948, as for other Yiddish writers in Israel, the danger of being alive only through translation is all too real. This anxiety about translation and about the relevance of Yiddish in a monolingual Israeli culture hostile to diasporic languages is linked to the question of Yiddish after the Holocaust and its status in becoming post-vernacular. When the poet speakers ask, shall I plant my tongue and wait till it transforms into our forefathers' raisins and almonds? What kind of joke preaches my poetry brothers with whiskers that soon my mother tongue will set forever? He struggles with how his own poetic language, mein Zung, could be preserved and understood in Israel. Is it a mother tongue, Mameloshen, that is about to disappear? Is it going to turn into Avosdike Rojinkes mit Mandeln, the forefathers' raisin and almonds? Sutzkever illustrates here various perceptions of Yiddish in Israel, either as a Mameloshen that must be suppressed and forgotten, as a language that is only suited for nostalgic songs like Rojinkes mit Mandeln, or as a funny language that is used for jokes, a kind of comic relief like whiskers that somebody adds to a portrait. For the poet-speaker, Yiddish is neither funny nor nostalgic. It is not going to disappear either, in spite of the fact that most of its native speakers were murdered in the Holocaust, and in spite of its suppression in Israel. What is most significant for him is a literary lineage of poetic fathers, which goes back to Levi Yitzchok of Berdichev, the Hasidic rabbi who is known to argue with God in Yiddish. It continues with Yehoash, Solomon Bloomgarden, the major Yiddish American poet, master of Impressionist poetry, whose translation of the Bible gave it a new lease among modern Yiddish readers. From here he moves to Moshe Kulbak, the modernist Yiddish poet, novelist, and dramatist, who was born in Smorgon, the same town near Vilna where Sutzkever himself was born, and who was an inspiration to the young Vilna group in which the young Sutzkever has begun his literary career. Now, where, the speaker poet asks, this tradition of modern Yiddish literature will go when Yiddish language itself is in danger of decline? Maybe at the Wailing Wall, Kotel Marovi, the site most associated with traditional Jewish memory, and now also with the new state of Israel. If this is where Yiddish will go to its decline, then I shall come there, open my mouth, and like a lion garbed in fiery scarlet, I shall swallow the language as it sets, and wake all the generation with my roar. At the end of this powerful poem, the speaker poet hijacks many devices of the prophetic associated with Hebrew national poetry, the roaring lion, the fiery scarlet garment, the language itself, which he devours and swallows like Jeremiah the prophet. Unlike the prophet, however, the speaker poet does not seek the fire to devour the people, but rather for him to devour the Yiddish word. The meaning of this is a symbiosis between the speaker poet and the language. After 1948, Sutzkever indeed became an embodiment of Yiddish, its literature and culture in Israel. He did it by writing and publishing Yiddish poetry and by establishing and editing the journal Die Goldene Kette, the Golden Chain, in Israel. No less important, he did it by becoming a father figure to a new generation of Yiddish Israeli writers, especially to the group Young Israel, that included Yossel Birstein, Zvi Eisenman, Avrom Rinzler, Hey Binyamin, known to us better as Binyamin Arushovsky, Arshav, Rivka Bastman, Moshe Jungman, and others. Most of these Yiddish writers were Holocaust survivors who began writing Yiddish in Israel. And here are a few photographs from the group in 1954 and 1956, actually in Kibbutz Gvat. These writers created modernist Yiddish Israeli literature in the 50s and 60s. In one way or another, they continued to tackle the questions asked in Sutzkever's poem and gave it different answers. This can be seen in the literature as well as in speeches, essays, and manifestos. Take, for example, Yossel Birstein, and here's a photograph of Yossel Birstein at the bottom together with Avrom Rinzler and the very young Benjamin Harshav Harushovsky. Birstein was born in Poland and immigrated to Australia at the age of 17, moved to Israel, to the Israeli kibbutz in 1948 after he lost all of his family in the war. Birstein spoke about his experience at the first meeting of Young Israel in October 1951. His address, a Yiddisher Schreiber in Kibbutz, a Yiddish writers in Kibbutz, opened with the following words, quote, "In the first day when I arrived in the kibbutz, I received a letter from an older Yiddish poet. The letter said, 'You live in a kibbutz now. Vergesst nicht dort, als du bist a Yiddischer Dichter. Do not forget there that you are a Jewish Yiddish poet.'" This reminded Birstein of his father's warning when he immigrated to Australia, "Sollt nicht vergessen dem goyische Land, as du bist a Yid." Do not forget in the Goyish Gentile land that you are a Jew. Although Birstein was well aware of the difference between Melbourne, Australia, and the Israeli kibbutz, he did not fail to notice the sad irony of his own analogy. He also highlighted the fact that for him Yiddish was a father tongue associated with the memory of his father as well as with the father figure of the Yiddish poet. But Birstein's address also reflected the anomaly in which he and other Yiddish writers and artists found themselves in Israel. In Yiddish, the adjective Yiddisher signifies either Jewish or Yiddish, which is a result of centuries of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. In the Israeli kibbutz, this double meaning falls apart, since the kibbutz is a paradigm of Zionist national culture in which the ideology of monolingualism left, at least officially, no place for Yiddish. Birstein was keenly aware of this. His proposition to his fellow Yiddish writers was that in the face of hostility and indifference to Yiddish, the writer, quote, should do what he always did in the diaspora, namely, surround himself with Yiddish books and create a spiritual environment in which the Yiddish word would not be forgotten. This proposition seems to be in dialogue with Sutzkever's poem, with its lineage of Yiddish diasporic and Palestinian literature. However, Birstein was also concerned that this strategy will create a separation between the Yiddish Israeli writer and the non-Yiddish environment and will make him or her isolated and perhaps non-relevant. This posed a difficult dilemma. For some, the way to face it was by switching to Hebrew or writing in the two languages, and actually that's something that Birstein did later and Arshav as well. For some, the way was to face it by switching, for others, remaining relevant meant writing a modernist, daring and fresh Yiddish literature, one that defies both the Israeli pull towards monolingualism as well as the conservative tendencies of post-Holocaust Yiddish literature around the world, which was, according to David Roskis, built on two pillars, utopian faith and collective lamentation. The most radical member of Jung Israel was Avrom Rinzler, over there in the picture on the left, who was born in Bukovina and arrived in Israel in 1949 after surviving the Holocaust. In 1954, Rinzler published in the journal Jung Israel a cycle of poems called Paragraphen von Heint, Paragraphs from a Today. It was published side by side with Yossel Bergner's, the artist, his illustration to Kafka's novel The Castle. The opening poem of this magnificent and difficult cycle is called Inscription. And this is the poem with my very partial and literal translation. And you can see the Yiddish and I'll read the English. The feet of the lines of a Yiddish poem can go up in a rhythmic stairs to a worthy heaven, only if sleepers of a psalm will tread on tired, modest rhymes with syllabus in the rhythm of Tzenarena. Oh, you herds of patriarchal songs, because of the wordness of the new eye, of course, a nape of the old language must bleed. This enigmatic poem ends up with with what seems like a violent call for Yiddish, the alte Sprach, the old language, to bleed. However, when examining it more carefully, we realize that it responds to both the low status of Yiddish in Israel as a nostalgic mameloshen, as well as to the conservative mood of Yiddish literature around the world. The speaker defies the tired, modest rhymes in the rhythm of the Tzenarena. He dismisses Yiddish poetry that is merely a pious recitation of Jewish mothers, as well as the patriarchal songs, monophonic poetry that walks around in two comfortable sleepers. Rinzler's poetic credo is built on the wordness and the new eye that a modernist Israeli Yiddish poet must adopt. This credo is further explicated in an essay Rinzler published in the second volume of the journal Jung Israel, which is entitled Randen, Margins. And here is just a short quote. The further development of our literature is not dependent on any cultural, political preconceptions or preconditions. No neo-national conceptions will affect its continuation. For us, language and literature must start to exist as two independent and separate territories. Rinzler's text employs the style of modernist manifestos of Yiddish avant-garde movements, but brings it to Israel of the 1950s. He calls here for a new transnational Yiddish literature in which Israel plays an important role, but he also insists that it can exist in an increasingly post-vernacular era. If we need living vocabulary, he writes, we can find it in the written word, Wortschrift, which can be a bastion for a new literary language. He declares that Yiddish Israeli writers must smash the archaic frame of the Loshen Mame Kodesh in order to create a free territory for functional literature. Rinzler's poem and essays articulated a call for an Israeli neo-modernist poetics that was radically new, but also in dialogue with Yiddish modernist literature in Europe and America. It is significant, of course, that Rinzler points to the danger of Yiddish becoming Loshen Mame Kodesh, thus mixing the notion of Yiddish as a mother tongue and the Loshen Kodesh, the holy tongue, which is also the father tongue. It is not coincidental that when Rinzler invokes Yiddish as a meta-language, he uses these Jewish tropes, which are also the tropes of the linguistic family romance. Traditional Jewish Ashkenazi culture was for centuries diglossic. Yiddish, the common vernacular, was marked as Mameloshen, the mother tongue. Hebrew, the language of sacred text, was marked as Loshen Kodesh, the language that a father transmits to his son. Jewish modernity, Haskalah, and nationalism disrupted this diglossic condition. A new state of affairs was created, one that gave new meaning to these terms, in which Yiddish was seen as feminine and diasporic language associated with images of Jewish motherhood, and Hebrew was seen as the masculine language associated with the Jewish nation and with the figure of the Zionist New Hebrew man. Outside the Jewish context, mother tongue seems to be a more neutral term, one that is deeply rooted in unconsciousness. Mother tongue is simply native language, one that was transmitted together with the mother's milk. However, the term mother tongue, Muttersprache, became common only at the end of the 18th century. In 1813, Friedrich Schleiermacher claimed that a writer can produce original work only in his mother tongue, thus paving the way to the romantic national monolingual paradigm. As Yasmin Yildiz shows, the mother tongue is, quote, the affective note at the center of the monolingual paradigm. One that relies heavily on the invocation of the maternal. It stands for a unique, irreplaceable, unchangeable biological origin that situates the individual automatically in a kinship and by extension in the nation, end quote. Jewish multilingualism, with its own complex linguistic family romance, never confirmed with this paradigm, nor was it the state of affairs in Israel of the 1950s. Sutzkever, Bierstein, Rinzler, as well as the artist Yossel Bergner, all grew up in multilingual environment. They spoke, read, and sometimes wrote Polish, Hebrew, German, Russian, and Yiddish. For them, Yiddish was not mameloshen in any simple sense, personal or national, nor was it a foreign language. Yiddish was one language among others, a fusion language that assimilated into itself other languages, including Hebrew. For Bergner, with which I'm going to end, who grew up in a family in which German, Yiddish, and Polish was spoken and read, Yiddish was primarily a father tongue. He was the son of the Yiddish poet Melech Ravitch. In the process of becoming an artist, Bergner struggled both with his father and with the place of Yiddish literature as part of and parcel of world literature and Jewish literature in his artistic work. His lifelong fascination with Kafka and with Yiddish literature was related to the fact that his father was the first translator of Kafka from German into Yiddish, and that one of the texts that most influenced him as a young man was Kafka's letter to his father. And you can see here some of his work of the translation of the process into Yiddish. Bergner wrote about his arrival in Israel in 1950 in these terms. I did not come to Israel as a Zionist, but as a Jew. Nobody knew how to take me in. A painter who speaks Yiddish and reads Proust and Kafka. I would like to propose that this quote by Bergner, with which I conclude, captures not only his own experience, but also something about the place of Yiddish in Israel. I suspect it also tells us something important about the larger issue of multilingualism in Israeli literature and culture. Thank you very much.
We're going on to you. Okay. All right, so thanks, Shachar. Our next presenter is Adriana Jacobs, who is here all the way from the UK, from Oxford, where she is the Associate Professor and Cowley Lecturer in Modern Hebrew Literature. She is finishing a book called Strange Cocktail, Translation and the Making of Modern Hebrew Literature, which should be coming out soon. She publishes widely on modern Hebrew literature in translation and is also herself a translator from Hebrew. And her presentation today is entitled Like a Centipede, Multiple Voices, Harold Schimmel's Translingual Poetry.
First, we have a handout, because I realize it's going to be a little hard to see everything. We don't have a lot of handouts, so here's the share. Yeah, sorry, it's going to be a little hard to read what's going on back there, but hopefully there are handouts and maybe cover around them, like it's a campfire translation. Well, first of all, thank you so much to the organizers, and I don't know if Kelsey's in the room, but she's been extremely helpful with the logistics of the trip, so I wanted to thank her personally. And I'm really excited to be a part of this event. As Liora mentioned, translation has been very central to my research and also to my own practice as a translator, and has will hopefully soon crystallize in this book project. that I've been working on last few years. So today I'm going to talk about Harold Schimmel, and since you already have the title, I'll just begin. In its fall 1965 issue, the editors of Epoch, a literary journal published out of Cornell University, had this to say about one of its most frequent contributors, the poet Harold Schimmel. Harold Schimmel is, according to our frequent reassertions, one of the most powerful voices in contemporary poetry in English. His continued residence in Jerusalem removes him from the American scene, end quote. This remark marked Schimmel's last appearance in Epoch, though he would continue to publish in other American journals over the next several years. But what stood out for me when I first read this was the clarification in English, as if the editors felt it necessary to explain something that may no longer be obvious in light of Schimmel's current place of residence in Jerusalem. Indeed, following the 1962 publication of his first and only collection in English, a book titled First Poems, the New Jersey native, who was born in 1935, relocated to Israel and settled in the environs of Jerusalem, where he immediately befriended many prominent writers and artists of the period and was active in both publishing and translation. After a poetic silence, quote unquote, of about 10 years, Schimmel published Shirei Malon Zion, Hotel Zion poems, which consisted primarily of original Hebrew poems, with the exception of 3 translations of poems originally written in English. With this publication, Schimmel entered the Israeli literary scene as a Hebrew poet. But this classification overstates the hybrid and multilingual poetry that Schimmel has published in the decades since. In her recent work on English writing by Israeli writers whose native language is Hebrew, the scholar Melissa Weininger has characterized this output as Hebrew in English. But what I want to address in the time I have remaining is some of the backstory of this relation between Hebrew and English, focusing primarily on Schimmel's engagement with Anglophone poetry via translation, and how it shaped an oeuvre that, in a reformulation of Weininger's phrase, constitutes what I would call English and Hebrew. Later in the talk, I'll draw your attention to one poem in particular, the one hovering on that screen, from Schimmel's 1986 collection, Loel, which exemplifies what I refer to in my title as his translingual poetry, a term that I use also to refer, in its conventional sense, to works written by a writer in a language which is not their native tongue, but also to works like Schimmel's that use translation to displace, deterritorialize, and unsettle their own origins and sources as a way of creating new relations to other languages, cultures, places, and histories even. In Israel, Schimmel quickly forged lasting friendships with the German-born Yehuda Amichai, British-born Dennis Silk, and the Tel Aviv natives Aaron Shabtai and Aryeh Sachs. They informally referred to themselves as Hamishpacha, the family, and congregated at Silk's home in Abu Tor in southeast Jerusalem. Between 1948 and 1967, as some of you know, the Israel-Jordanian border ran through Abu Tor, and the area attracted young bohemian artists, writers, and filmmakers who were energized creatively by life on the Arab-Jewish borderline. In the 1967 Six-Day War, Israeli forces secured Abu Tor, which resulted in a remapping of southern Jerusalem, and with it the dynamic of this creative milieu. In his long poem, Jerusalem 1967, which he dedicated to my friends Dennis, Aryeh, and Harold, Amichai recalls this moment in these words, and I'll recite them in English. A different city, perhaps, is now being cut in two lovers separated. Schimmel's participation in Israel's literary scene initially centered on writers affiliated with the journal Achshav, and he also collaborated with Silk to promote Israeli poetry in Hebrew in English translation. Silk and Schimmel also worked to create an audience for their own English language poetry. For example, several poems by Schimmel were published in the journal Now, a one-off English version of the journal Achshav. Though short-lived, this publication was notable because it suggests an attempt to advance an understanding of Israeli literature as multilingual. And yet, in his introduction, editor Maxim Guillen validates this kind of writing by calling attention to the transformative effects of foreign literatures on Hebrew writing in the early 20th century. And I quote now from his introduction. He writes, "The effect of foreign literature on Hebrew letters, which has been restricted by ideological considerations and the lack of a modern tradition, was invigorating. It's the editor's conviction that the influence of non-Hebrew writing published here may also be beneficial," end quote. The question that Guillen's assertion raises, however, is what these other languages stood to gain from Hebrew. Were composition and translation mutually reciprocal activities, or was this writing in English or any other language for that matter, peripheral to the more central project of developing modern Hebrew literature in Israel? Some of the English poems that appeared in Now, in fact, made their way into Schimmel's first Hebrew chapbook, which is titled Hashirim, the Poems, and this was published in 1968. In fact, the National Library of Israel has, I think, the only existing copy of it. And their inclusion suggests that translation and original writing between English and Hebrew were interrelated practices for Schimmel in this period. But these poems were also translated by Amichai and Natan Zach, which gave them the authoritative stamp of approval by Israel's literary center and its Hebrew literary center. Shirei Melon Zion, with this collection, Schimmel entered the Israeli literary scene as an original, which I put in quotes, and not translated Hebrew poet. And while many writers have switched their literary language later in life, for example, Vladimir Nabokov, with whom Schimmel studied at Cornell, Schimmel's switch from English to Hebrew was notable in this period because unlike a writer like Nabokov, who published in English, or even someone like Samuel Beckett, who published in French, or wrote in French, Schimmel was moving to a language with a significantly smaller readership and circulation. In fact, I think this is precisely the subtext of the epoch remark that I quoted earlier. While these linguistic shifts were common in the lives of Hebrew writers of the early to mid-20th century, by the time Schimmel emigrated to Israel in the mid-1960s, this generation had made way for poets like Amichai, who aspired to be, quote, sent into orbit, which is how Amichai put it in a Paris Review interview, and he was referring to being translated into English. Schimmel, on the contrary, appeared to be going in the wrong direction. And I say this even though I've also found material that suggests that following the publication of Shirei Malon Zion, he was still trying to get his work published in English. Despite the personal relationships that he forged with Israel's literary center, Schimmel primarily has elected to remain outside of the public sphere of Hebrew Israeli literature. And though journals like Chadarim and Helikon have championed his work consistently over the years, he has been by and large perceived as a meshorer lemishorerim, a poet's poet. This may have something to do with his singular poetic idiom, an American blend, in his words, that has resisted prevailing trends in Hebrew poetry and has proven unassimilable despite Israeli literature's engagements with American culture. In part, this is because Schimmel's blend has made considerable, sometimes impossible demands on the Hebrew reader, who not only must have considerable knowledge of the quote-unquote Hebrew echo chamber, but also a command of 19th and 20th century American poetry and translation, and to be able to identify references and allusions to poets like Ezra Pound, Louis Zukowski, and Emily Dickinson, to name a few, in Schimmel's non-vernacular Hebrew. In fact, in an early review of his work, Hanan Hever noted that Schimmel's penchant for slight avririm associations around which the poem forms tends to be off-putting to a reader who is not always able to capture these slight allusions and references. And this results in a poetry that excels at blending together a variety of cultural and historical materials, but maybe is less successful at quote-unquote blending in. In his own words, Schimmel writes, "This tenterhook hold on words for every poet is his own historical dictionary, often results in a non-spoken language. The lingua franca of the poet is the product of a multiple vision," end quote. In 1979, Schimmel published Ara, Aramaic for Earth, which is the first part of a long poem that has occupied him for most of his literary career, and which is in large part inspired by Zhukovsky's monumental long poem, A. As is the case for A, the exuberant range of subjects and themes and forms that shape Ada constitute what Schimmel calls his historic and contemporary particulars. And these converge in and are embodied by the poem itself. In Ada, Schimmel rejected his American past and his American English and replaced it with a kind of chalutz self-mythology, rewriting his history as though, in his words, I had had no past before Hebrew and before this land, end quote. Through this act of revision, Schimmel claimed or tried to claim an imagined native status in modern Hebrew literature, but it proved to be an unstable posture, in large part because Schimmel's plotting of this mythology relied on a range of contiguities and acts of translation that unsettled the project from the onset. In other words, the very translation activity that activated Schimmel's self-fashioning as a Hebrew poet in the 1970s developed in his own Hebrew poetry as a kind of translational and multilingual poetics, which was itself a continuation and expansion of his earlier American poetry in English. So there was a considerable tension there between the desire to nativize, but also to continue this sort of American project in Hebrew. In 1986, Schimmel published the second part of Ada, which he titled Lo'el, after his mentor, the American poet Robert Lowell, often regarded as the father of confessional poetry. Schimmel's Lo'el is a collection of sonnets gathered into 3 sections, titled Boston, New York, and Jerusalem, respectively. It is in Lo'el that Schimmel abandons the pretense of blending in and reinstates the landscapes of his past. And perhaps it's not a coincidence that with this particular collection, Schimmel, in his translator Peter Cole's words, gradually slid off the map of Israeli literature. In Ada, the line between translation and writing blurs entirely, as it does in Lowell's own work. In Lo'el, Boston, New York, and Jerusalem are indeed real places, but how Schimmel moves between them and how he links them together produces texts that are, in his words, polyphonic, shifting, fickle. Jahan Ramazani's exposition on traveling poetries in his book, A Transnational Poetics, addresses the implications of such writing in a national context. And bear with me, I want to read a particular quote from this book that I've always found particularly useful in thinking about this particular collection of Schimmel's writing in general. Ramazani writes, although national labels impute singularity and coherence, poets make and remake their often interstitial citizenship, as we have seen, through formal and ideological rewritings, through sonic mutations and tropological reinscriptions that can span multiple nationalities and ethnicities. A concept of poetic transnationalism, perhaps even poetic citizenship of a kind, allows for the complex tessellations of modern and contemporary writing, poems formed by both unwilled imaginative inheritances and elective identifications across national borders. In this context, Schimmel's Lo'el marks both a continuation of and a departure from the Ada project, an expansion of a poetic map without a center. Without erasing or disavowing the earlier revisionist history of Ada, Schimmel reinstates not only his American history, but also reinstates what he has called the language of the father, in this case, his American English. In his introduction to Lo'el, he summarizes this project as follows. The Encyclopedia Hebraica includes entries for Boston and New York. Now, so do I. Lowell, it's contagious. So Lowell traveled to Israel in March 1969 for a 2-week literary tour that took him around the country. And through Schimmel, he made the acquaintance of Amichai and Sil. And also, if Schimmel's poem on the matter is to be trusted, he even managed to insult Leah Goldberg at a party. Schimmel seizes Lowell's visit as an opportunity to revisit and reconstruct his own literary biography. But as Schimmel himself admits, throughout these poems, autobiographically real events are confused with reimaginings of what could have taken place. Translation is central to this reimagining. Throughout Lowell, one encounters Lowell's own poetry in Schimmel's translation, as well as numerous references to and quotations of American English poetry, including Schimmel's own English poems in his Hebrew translation. While the first books of Ada were primarily invested in a poetry of settlement and a kind of native poetics, through which Schimmel staked a claim in Tarbut Ivrit, in Hebrew culture, in Lowell, which Schimmel also exposes, as so much of our work here does, and as this very symposium intends to do, is what Moti Regev has described as the invention of a locally specific native Jewish culture in Hebrew. And one way that Schimmel accomplished this was through the circulation via translation of his English. Sonnet 90, which I hope most of you have before you, and if you don't, try to find someone who does. Thank you. But it's up there on the screen. Sets out to reconstruct an informal poetry reading that took place during Lowell's trip and included the company of Amichai Silk and Schimmel. I'll read it in the original, and actually, I may just have to read. Does everybody have the poem? I'm just curious. Does someone not have a handout or access to it? Because for the sake of time, I'm going to try to avoid reading all 4 versions. Okay, I'll read the Hebrew, and then there's a kind of my literal translation follows, so if you need it, you can follow along there. תשמור את מילותיי לעד בעד, תמן השוהה של מסכנות ועשן, בעד הזפת שבן של סבלנות, משותפת ועמל נאמן. מים בבירות נובגורוד חייבים להיות שחורים וממותקים, כדי לשקף כוכב עם 7 סנפירים בחג המולד. הקראת לנו את תרגומך למנדלשטם מאותם דפים מצהיבים. או ארץ אבות ראי עוזרי הגס. זכונה אחיך הבלתי מזוהה, הכופר ממשפחת העם. וכשדניס לאחר מכן הקריא את שירו של עמיחי, חבל היינו המצאה טובה, אמרת, סליחה, פשוט איני מבין על מה מדובר כאן. וורפים כולם, הם פרקו אותנו זו מזו, ודניס בסבלנות השיב. זה שיר על סוף האהבה, ויהודה הסמיק. Okay, so hopefully those who couldn't follow the Hebrew can read the literal translation. Sonnet 90 begins with several lines from one of Lowell's translations of an untitled poem by the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam. This poem opens with this line, "Keep my words forever," and appears in a collection titled The Moscow Notebooks, 1930-1934, and is addressed to the poet Anna Akhmatova. In Schimmel's poem, these lines are recited by Lowell, followed by Silk's reading of an Amichai poem, presumably an English translation for Lowell's benefit, since he didn't know Hebrew, as far as I know. The poem Chaval Hayinu Amsa'a Tova, a pity we were a good invention, had appeared a year earlier in Amichai's landmark collection, Achshav Bara'ash, Now in the Storm. Given the date of Lowell's visit, it's possible that they're even reading one of translations by Arthur Gutman. Both Silk and Schimmel would have been familiar with her translations, but it's also likely that Silk, a capable translator himself, provided his own rendering of the poem. So rewriting my translation of Sonnet 90, only this time with Lowell's English translation of the Mandelstam poem, as well as Gutman's translation of Amichai, which I'm going to imagine that they read, produces the text, the third text in the handout. Should I read it out loud, or can you see it? What do you think? Oh, I can, yes, that's right. I'll scroll down. So, hold on. Oh my gosh. All right, I am not a PC person, as you can tell. So I'm trying to, yeah, if you can do it, thanks.
If I can do it. That's it, right?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Right, okay. So then what I basically did is sort of inserted what I imagine was being read, which is Lowell's translation of the Mandelstam, as well as Asya Gutman's translation of Amichai. So inserting Lowell's and Gutman's words, rather than retranslating these passages as I did earlier, reveals an interesting modification of Amichai's poem, which is in the line when Lowell sort of is reciting a line from the poem, the Rofim Kulam, that line, all the doctors unloaded us one by one. Okay. And it suggests that either Lowell is incorrectly paraphrasing what he has heard or that it has been mistranslated for him. The original line in Hebrew, Rofim kulam hem perku otanu zemizo, so perku, translates more or less literally as doctors, all of them, they took us apart from one another or they dismantled us from one another. This further informs the reader that Gutman uses some liberty in rendering Rofim as surgeons in her original translation, most likely with the understanding of taking apart as a kind of surgery. So that's a liberty she takes as the translator. What Schimmel has Lowell say, however, is they unloaded us from one another, modifying Amichai's perku, they dismantled or broke apart, so that it reads as parku, they unloaded. And I've checked this nikud like 100 times, and it's just very clear that that is what Schimmel has written. This slight change in vocalization completely alters the meaning of the poem's key line. Whereas the Hebrew poem expresses the end of the romance as an amputation, Lowell's words characterizes the end of the love affair as the release of a burden. This rewritten, retranslated line must also be read in the context of Lowell and its preoccupation with tradition and influence, and the anxiety of influence. With this mistranslation, Schimmel in effect projects his own desire to unload his predecessor and to rewrite him, an act that also allows him to unload the self-mythologizing revisions of his earlier Hebrew collections. All of this translation made me wonder what the poem would look like if his writing was returned to its source, as it were. And the result is the fourth poem on the handout, which I'm not going to read because I am now completely out of time. Oops. Yikes, Shachar. Can you perform your magic again? Sorry. Thank you. And so when you bring it back to these sort of source texts right there, yeah, that one. This has the effect of isolating the English dialogue in a really interesting way. And what we see here is that Lowell sort of appears as a kind of clueless bystander. There's those 3 question marks at the end. What is more, his inability to understand Amichai's love poem deflates his status. Now he's the student patiently educated by the younger poets for whom he has served as a mentor and paragon. The collective patience in Mandelstam's poem echoes in Silk's patient explanation of Amichai's poem. At the same time, by recomposing the poem with the original source text, we can appreciate the considerable space that Mandelstam's poem, and specifically Lowell's translation of it, takes up in Harold Schimmel's poem. And it's a space that Schimmel also claims for himself in his Hebrew retranslation of the poem. So for many 20th century poets, the language of youth, the language of the father, as Schimmel put it, was not modern Hebrew, and often underlying the poet's language in this acquired vernacular were various ongoing processes of translation that allowed the father and mother tongue to remain in and unsettle the Hebrew text. But the injunction, Tishmor et milotai, guard my words, which lies at the heart of the translations and retranslations that Schimmel engages in Lowell, is not only a call to remember or preserve the past, it can also be projected onto the translingual poet himself, whose translations and retranslations constitute the Nachleben, or living on, or survival, or afterlife of his many languages, and his English in particular, which settles restlessly in a poem that must gather one's contradictions. Thank you.
All right, well, great. Well, we're moving on to our third presenter, who is Alex Moshkin. Alex has traveled the longest distance to be here for this conference, so he gets that distinction. So Alex is, generally speaking, a PhD student in comparative literature at the University of Pennsylvania, where he's working on a dissertation about Israeli-Russian film, literature, and visual art between 1991 and basically the present. But this year, he's actually living in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, as a fellow at the Queer Theory School. So he's here all the way from Bishkek, and we will hear his presentation on Beyond the Wall, the encounter between Russophone writers and the State of Israel.
Thank you. So in this presentation, I examine Israeli literature written in the Russian language in the context of the larger discussion of Israel's language politics and the shifting ideological context in Israel and the world in the 1970s and 1980s. Specifically, some of the questions I want to raise here relate to the political and geopolitical implications of multilingualism in Israel. First, how does contemporary linguistic diversity of Israeli literature that we explore in this conference challenge the established relations of inequality and dominance between Hebrew and non-Hebrew languages and literatures? And second, does writing in a language other than Hebrew constitute a priori challenge to the Zionist framework and the plea for cosmopolitan cohabitation? Or alternatively, should we treat multilingualism as a multifaceted phenomenon that can equally align with pluralism and diversity, as well as with populism and xenophobia? I will examine these questions using Israeli literature by Russian emigres in the 1970s and 1980s as my case study. So, needless to say, there is a long history of Hebrew-turned-Israeli literature written by Russian-speaking Jews that goes back to at least the beginning of the 19th century. Most of the founders of modern Hebrew language literature, as you know, Bialik, Chernychovsky, Brenner, Alterman, Shlonsky, Rachel, Penn, and many others, were born in the Russian Empire, were fluent in Russian, and were influenced by Russian literary and cultural tradition. The poetry of Bialik and Chernychovsky, for instance, was greatly inspired by Russian Silver Age. Brenner was a devout follower of Dostoevsky's psychological realism. Alexander Penn echoed Mayakovsky's futurist experimentations in his poetry. And moreover, because of the ideological and cultural affinity between the Soviet Union and the new Yishuv, a great number of canonical Russian and Soviet literary works were translated into Hebrew, the most famous of which include Shlonsky's centenary translation of Pushkin's Eugen Onegin in 1937, 100 years after the death of Pushkin, Leah Goldberg's relentless rendition of the 2,000 pages of Tolstoy's War and Peace into Hebrew, and Brenner's unusual translation of Crime and Punishment, which deleted most of the Christian themes and anti-Semitic passages from the original and replaced them with Jewish topics and quotations from the Torah. But in this presentation, I will take leave of the founders of Hebrew literature and instead investigate the largely ignored generation of Russian-speaking writers who settled in Israel roughly 60 or 70 years after Brenner and Bialik, during the 1970s and 1980s, and who, unlike their predecessors, refused to switch to Hebrew after their emigration. So, as I learned during my summer research at the National Library in Jerusalem in 2013, 6,586 Russian language books were published in Israel between 1970s and 2013, which is 1,273 in the 1970s and 1980s, and 5,313 between 1990 and 2013. Needless to say, this remarkable burst of literary creativity is closely related to the demographic change that have taken place in Israel since 1970s, when in the first stage, a critical mass of 150,000 Soviet Jewish dissidents and refuseniks relocated to Israel during the 70s and 80s, followed by another wave of 900,000 Russian-speaking Jews that started arriving at Ben Gurion Airport after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. So what was unique about these newcomers, especially those arriving after the collapse of the USSR, is that in contrast to all preceding waves of immigration to Israel, they were the first immigrant group to openly and quite successfully challenge the main tenets of Zionist ideology relating to Hebrew's linguistic supremacy, the halachic definition of who constitutes a Jew, and what they saw as the overwhelmingly religious character of the country. So, unimpressed with local Israeli culture, they established an extensive alternative cultural and social infrastructure in the Soviet image, consisting of Russian-language bookstores, publishing houses, daily newspapers, theater troupes, ethnic restaurants, external education programs like Mofet, non-kosher supermarkets, television channels, and even the Union of Russophone Writers of Israel, which is pretty much relocation of the Soviet institution to the Israeli space, thus introducing Russian language to virtually all areas of social life in Israel. Traditionally, scholars who examine Israeli Russian culture tend to emphasize its separatist and ethnocentric dimension. Specifically, they understand the decision of Israeli Russian authors to write in Russian as a subversive act that challenges one of the basic principles of Zionist ideology, the so-called Hebrew-only principle. In a context where Hebrew functions as a gatekeeper of Israel's monolithic national identity and as a tool for policing social boundaries between Jews and non-Jews and between the veteran population and the newcomers, the use of Russian does seem to challenge the peculiar ontological framework of the Israeli society, in which the nation-state, Hebrew language, and Judaism harmoniously coincide and conveniently exclude all other languages, religions, cultures, and claims for belonging. Yet when one considers the content of Israeli Russian culture in the 1970s and 80s, the situation becomes more complex. Without denying the separatist dimension of some Israeli Russian literature, I argue that in order to fully understand its cultural and ideological positioning, we need to take into account its overtly Zionist and anti-Soviet content and its geopolitical purpose during the Cold War. Contrary to the thesis of cultural segregation, the linguistic, quote-unquote, insubordination of Israeli Russian literature in the 1970s harmoniously coincided with the structures of state ideology and Jewish nationalism. In fact, Israeli Russian literature of this period demonstrates the peculiar cultural and social situation of Israel, which the renowned Israeli sociologist Baruch Kimmerling and Israeli Russian historian of ideas Dmitry Shumsky describe as a plurality of cultures without multiculturalism, a situation in which different ethnic, religious, and cultural groups in Israel simultaneously strive for institutional autonomy and at the same time emphasize their common Jewish identity, thus excluding the Arab minority and other minorities and other non-Jewish minorities, thereby preventing real multiculturalism from emerging. The Zionist identification of Israeli Russian literature is especially noteworthy when considered in the context of the Russian émigré literary tradition in the 20th century. In contrast to writers like Bunin, Nabokov, and Yosef Brodsky, who is very much a part of this university, Israeli Russian authors inverted the basic coordinates of the Russian émigré meta-narrative. Instead of yearning for birch trees, Russian peasants, and beloved Russian language, Israeli Russian authors perceived the state of Israel as a true homeland, the Soviet Union as a historical effervescence of the biblical Egypt, and structured their works by what the eminent Jewish historian Salo Baron calls the lachrymose conception of Jewish history, namely representation of the Jewish experience in the Soviet Union as one eternal chain of catastrophes and disasters. In other words, their literary works often focus on the inhumane treatment of Jewish dissidents in the Soviet prisons, like Natan Sharansky's Fear No Evil, describe the heroic battle of Jewish individuals against the ruthless Soviet regime, like Mikhail Kalik's And the Wind Returns, and juxtapose the precarious Jewish experience in the Soviet Union with a messianic future in the land of Israel. Chaim Bauch's Jacob's Ladder is one example. So David Markish, the son of the famous Yiddish poet Peretz Markish, who was killed during the Night of the Murdered Poets in 1952, sums up the general attitude of Israeli Russian literature in his well-known poem Blue Scream that was published in 1973. Can Can you see? So I'll read, if I read in Russians, can you all see the English translation? Okay. Я говорю о нас, сынах Синая, о нас, чей взгляд иным теплом согрет. Пусть русский люд ведет тропа иная, да их славянских дел нам дела нет. Мы ели хлеб их, но платили кровью. Счета сохранены, но не подведены. Мы отомстим цветами в изголовье их северной страны. So clearly, this unmistakable anti-Soviet and here anti-Russian flavor of Israeli-Russian literature reflects the degree to which this literature's devotions to Jewish nationalism and Zionist politics is a byproduct of this author's rejection of the Soviet Union. My colleague from University of Pennsylvania, Alexander Khazanov, wrote quite a great essay about that. So this ideological proclivity, however, put Israeli-Russian literature in stark opposition to the dominant trends of Hebrew literature during that time. In other words, while Russian speakers were re-articulating the dominant Israeli discourse of homecoming and reproducing the underlying logic of the master narrative that imagines Jewish life in the diaspora as necessarily leading towards death and destruction, Hebrew-speaking writers were, ironically, already working in an opposite direction, finally starting to notice the different voices and narratives of minority groups such as Holocaust survivors, Mizrahi Jews, and Palestinians that had previously been excluded from dominant Hebrew literature. In some sense, then, Israeli literature in Russian was more Israeli than writing in Hebrew of this period, more Catholic than the Pope, one might say. So, one second. Poetry about the Lebanon War in Russian and Hebrew provides a great opportunity to examine the incommensurability between these two strands of Israeli literature. In Hebrew language poetry, the 1982 Lebanon War in general and the infamous massacre in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila in particular triggered a deeply political anti-war poetic tradition. According to the literary critic James Young, the horrors of this war has prompted major Israeli writers and poets, including Amos Oz, Dalia Rabikovich, and Yitzhak Laor, to turn their attention away from traditional focus on the death of Israeli soldiers or the condition of bereaved families at home, towards the death and suffering of others, especially that of Arab children. The most iconic and etching example is Dalia Rabikovich's You Can't Kill a Baby Twice, in which the poet uses troubling Holocaust imagery to draw a parallel between the extermination of Jews by the Nazis and the complicity of the Israeli army in the massacre of the refugee camps in Lebanon. Russophone poetry about the Lebanon War is fundamentally different. Instead of focusing on the horrors of war, Israeli-Russian poetry, drawing inspiration from the Soviet tradition of writing about the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War, as it is known in Russian language, as a heroic and sacred battle between good and evil, presents an epic conflict and celebrates the brave deeds of ordinary Israeli soldiers in their struggle to protect the Jewish homeland. Whenever Arabs are mentioned, they're imagined as bloodthirsty animals that should be destroyed at all costs. This is precisely how leading Israeli-Russian poets such as Mikhail Gendelev and Mikhail Krobman write about this war. For instance, in his war notebooks, Krobman, a well-known avant-garde painter, poet, and translator who immigrated to Israel in 1971, begin one of his poems with the following. I'll read it in English, just so it will be easier to see. Despite my old age and sickness, I'm manning my rifle again. To be useful to my motherland, I've joined the IDF. The evil Arabs are encroaching on love, friendship, and comfort, and other countries assist them in branding us as criminals. Elsewhere, he writes, yes. We left behind our Jewish huts, our donkeys and our plows. Squealing, filthy Arab enemies are running away from us. We are pushing back Islam with weighty arguments, so it won't force itself on us again. Neither their prophet nor their Soviet guns can tip the balance in their favor. So in this mix of xenophobia and patriotism, Grobman mobilizes the figure of the little man to characterize himself as an ordinary Israeli who is ready, despite the old age and sickness, to fight for the protection of his people and his motherland. It doesn't matter that this motherland, quote unquote, is a place that the poet just recently immigrated to, or that he might be unable to communicate with his people because of a lack of shared language. Rather, the war becomes the ultimate melting pot that helps to reforge Russian speakers as part of the Jewish/Israeli collective, granting the first-person speaker access to the collective we. Against this backdrop of the hostile Muslim enemy, the speaker, the Jewish people, and the land of Israel coalesce into one. Clearly, this version of Israeli Russian literature, despite being written in a language other than Hebrew, is neither subversive of Zionist ideology nor threatening to the hegemony of Hebrew. In fact, during the 1970s and 1980s, Israeli Russian literature was actually funded by the Israeli government and subsidized by state institutions such as Lishkat HaKeshel. The main reason these 1,273 books in Russian were published in Israel in the first place between 1970s and 1989, at a time when the Soviet Union was closed off for cultural, social, and economic interaction, had less to do with the financial stimulus and more with the ideological usefulness of this literature to Israel during that time. As Karen Aviv and David Schneel remind us, during the Cold War, literary narratives and first-hand testimonies about the precarious condition of Soviet Jews behind the Iron Curtain were used strategically to remind the world why Israel, which saw itself as a place of refuge for world Jewry, was necessary in the first place, and this is precisely what Israeli literature did. Therefore, it is not coincidental that Grobman's poetry mentions the Soviet guns used by the Lebanese army and that certain unnamed other countries, obviously the Soviet Union, assist, quote unquote, what Grobman says, filthy Arab enemies in their total war against Israel. What these lines demonstrate is that despite the inherently Soviet aesthetic quality of Grobman's poetry, Israeli Russian literature's content, including Grobman's, is anti-Soviet through and through. Moreover, these lines reflect the fact that the peculiar synergy of Zionism and anti-Soviet dither in Israeli Russian literature is a product of the clash of civilizations between the Soviet Union and the Western Bloc during the Cold War. In other words, this literature's over-identification with democracy, the West, and Israel, something that is clear from reading, let's say, Shalansky's Fear No Evil, so this over-identification with democracy, the West, and Israel might explain its condescending and Orientalist attitude towards anything it perceives as Eastern, including the Soviet Union, the biblical Egypt, and contemporary Arab countries. So to conclude, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the demand for dissident literature rapidly deteriorated, and the funding quickly dried up. Israeli Russian literature, however, continued to thrive, now because of the mass arrival of 900,000 Russian-speaking Jews to Israel after the collapse of the Soviet Union. As a result of these demographic changes, contemporary Israeli Russian literature became more heterogeneous, yet certain trends from the 1970s continued to be at the forefront of Israeli Russian literature in the 1990s and 2000s, including its ultra-nationalist agenda, intolerance towards minority groups that do not fit into the Zionist framework, and support for the settler movement. Ultimately, one can see important connections between Israeli Russian literature's messianic project of re-injecting Zionism into the fabric of the Israeli society in the 1970s and more recent phenomena such as Lieberman's ethno-nationalist politics, Larissa Trembovlil's marriage to the imprisoned assassin of Yitzhak Rabin Yigal Amir, and Lena Bosinov's public act of self-burning and protest of Sharon's withdrawal from Gaza in 2005. These examples demonstrate how right-wing tendencies that were sown in Israeli-Russian literature and culture in the 1970s came home to roost in the 1990s and 2000s. Thank you.
This was just fascinating. I'll just briefly introduce myself for those who don't know me. I'm a fellow this year at the Frankel Institute. I'm also an assistant professor of history and Jewish studies, as well as Israel-Palestine studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And it is such a pleasure to have the opportunity to respond to this really wonderfully coordinated and combined set of papers to think holistically about multilingualism in Israeli literature. So I have some thematic observations, some broader questions, which I hope will kind of propel us into our conversation afterwards. So I just want to start by kind of noting that Zionism, as we know, took on various forms in various settings, both diasporic and in Palestine, Israel. But the romantic, cultural, labor-led Zionism was at the heart of much of the cultural studies work. So, for example, at the heart of much of the literature and cultural studies work that's being done today, we have in mind the vision of cultural Zionism that was most rigid on the question of language. And that cultural Zionism in question was premised on the romantic nationalist idea that a proper nation has a single language that's rooted in its ancient depths of its organic existence, and that the nation can only be expressed through that single language, and that therefore any multilingualism is negative or destructive. So much of the work going on today on Jewish multilingualism, or multilingualism in general in Palestine and Israel, is premised on the idea that monolingual Hebrew is somehow equated with Orthodox Zionism, whereas multilingualism existed in more of a sphere of either indifference, ambivalence, or resistance to these dictates. But the field of studies of multilingualism in Israeli literature over the past decade, or maybe more, has taken this sphere of indifference, ambivalence, or resistance and really run with it, celebrating multilingualism as evidence of spaces of contact, of liminal zones, of the fragmentation in practice of national orthodoxy. And in fact, if we're being self-conscious about it, this perspective reflects a growing discomfort in our own academic communities about Zionism and its history, and a concurrent desire to explore its less hegemonic or more ambivalent or even counter-hegemonic spaces. But I think it's worth questioning this often axiomatic association we presume between multilingualism and ambivalence towards Zionism's hegemonic claims. And so with that, I want to start with Alex's paper, and I'm not going to speak about the papers in order, because his paper throws a wrench right into the middle of this presumption by sharing with us a number of right-wing, very, very much Zionist Russian language writers. And he reminds us that while the association between Zionism and Hebrew monolingualism certainly applied in the past and may still apply in some circles, it's become something of a straw man. Being multilingual or thinking about multilingualism might be a way to challenge Zionism, and it certainly is. But the Zionism that's being challenged today no longer requires monolingualism, if it ever did. Nowadays, certainly Zionism, in its most sort of devoted and even right-wing forms, has both monolingual and multilingual expressions. And beyond the Russian expressions, you have English language and French language Jews who are very, very strongly Zionist. Just as anti-Zionism or critiques of Zionism also have both monolingual and multilingual expressions. So if that's the case, I might ask the panel, what is the specific utility of engaging with these multilingual modes of critique per se? Moreover, how might the revelation of multilingual right-wing Zionism remind us of forms and expression of Zionism outside the kind of cultural Zionism we assume, whether it's today or in other periods? whether it's the political Zionism of diasporic figures who also never took on Hebrew seriously, the practical Zionism associated with immigration, which of course in many settings worked together with the conquest of language ideology, but contained other elements that could in other circumstances be detached from the language demands. So does the revelation of pro-Zionist multilingualism, whether now or in the past, challenge the notion that cultural Hebrew-oriented Zionism was actually the essence of Zionist hegemony? There's also the question that comes up reading these papers about what I might call multiple multilingualisms, which intersect in the Israeli space. So most of the research going on, and we can see it in these papers, kind of picks one of these multiple multilingualisms and explores its fascinating dynamics. But I think it's great to look at these papers together and ask what kinds of interchange or conversations might exist between them. So to take Shachar's and Yael's papers sort of together for a second, they explore boundary spaces moving in two directions that reflect, but also might encourage us to problematize a major divide in Israeli culture between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim. Shachar considered Ashkenazi Jews, a few specific Jews connected to Yiddish and the Ashkenazi Jewish diaspora, including in Israel, whereas Yael considered Mizrahi Jewish Israelis in their interaction with Palestinians. And I think it's easy to read them as kind of two separate worlds of multilingual concern. The anxiety in the poetry and writing of some of Shachar's figures circles not only around the loss of Yiddish, but the loss of Jewishness in the Israeli setting. So Yiddish, i.e. Jewish, literally, seems to bring the Jewishness of the land back into focus. The Wailing Wall becomes the setting for the poet to devour, kind of take in the Yiddish language. And the meaning of Yiddish as Jewish and the common association in Israel of religious traditionalism, especially in Jerusalem, with Ashkenazim and Ashkenazi religious traditionalism might make this association seem obvious. But we might also ask about religious Mizrahi Jews. We tend to focus on the Jewishness of Ashkenazi Jews and the Arabness of Arab Jews, but how might similar dynamics of longing, and specifically Jewish loss, pertain in the Mizrahi case as well? And what about the presence of the Arab in Yiddish Hebrew thinking, right? Is the Galut or Eastern Europe the main other? What about other others making their way into Yiddish language writing? Now, just to turn to Yael, in the poems that Yael evaluates, written by Mizrahi Jewish writers in response or in conversation with Mahmoud Darwish's State of Siege, the writers are doing something a little bit different because they're trying to enact a restoration rather than a preservation. It's an attempt to be more than monolingual, which is taken to mean more than limited by national hegemony. And in fact, Yael's paper is the most explicit about multilingualism as a potentially anti-nationalist or activist move. In the case of Arabic, there's a clear present other, the Palestinian kind of embodied by Darwish, whom the Jew has wronged, who is limited by the Jew's very presence, a zero-sum game where, quote, one man's departure does not guarantee another's return. The grappling with power differentials is key to Yael's analysis, and the struggle over poetry's lack of ability to confront them is a frustration. Here, multilingualism, from the perspective of the Jewish writers, is actually an unachieved and maybe unachievable utopia. But here I'm intrigued by the identity politics of discovery, especially in cases where the Mizrahi poets are not themselves native speakers in Arabic. Why is an Iraqi Jew who doesn't speak Arabic different from an Ashkenazi Jew who doesn't speak Arabic? When we move beyond the assumption that a community speaks X language because that's the community they speak, how can we start talking about cultures of aspirational multilingualism that maybe transcend people's actual lineage or heritage? And what are the politics of these aspirational multilingualisms? And I want to conclude here with some remarks on Adriana's paper, which bisects some of these questions in a really interesting way. So Schimmel, was an English language poet who shifted to Hebrew, lived on a geographic boundary line between Hebrew and Arabic inflected space. He knew Robert Lowell, who in turn was in conversation with Russian language poetry. There's a lot of language dimensions going on here. And the family that was described of Shimmel's friends seemed to aspire to what Ramazani called, quote, being citizens of imaginative webs formed by cross-national reading and rewriting. But I noticed that Adriana in her presentation now actually cut off the last part of that quote, which was in the example that in the paper she gave me, which says that when such poets come up against hard national lines, it may not count for much that they practice traveling poetics. So, you know, it seems on the face of it that this English, Hebrew, Russian literary space in Jerusalem seems to exist outside of the more widespread language contacts and conflicts during 1960s Israel, certainly the Yiddish and Arabic dynamics that we heard about. Is that what hegemonic language does? It lets you ignore some of these challenges. So I want to know more about how and why these writers were, quote unquote, energized by living on the Abu Tor borderline, which kind of reminds me of gentrifiers loving living in diverse neighborhoods and having lots of fun. But I'm also wondering, are they limited by this line? And also, what are the politics of living on that line? Did they engage politically with that line? How do the translations, mistranslations, self-translations, and interlingual connections of the mishpacha relate to both the more monolingual sphere or to the Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, and Russian-specific language communities emerging in Israel around this same time? And Adriana's work raises for me a distinction between what I might call high multilingualism, in which Hebrew is the less global, less cultured language, and maybe we call it low multilingualism, where Hebrew is coexisting with languages that are also in different ways limited in their cachet or perceived value. So this actually takes us full circle to Alex's paper to ask, how does the relatively high value of Russian enable a different kind of multilingualism? And we can ask the same about the role of English. It also, when we think about hierarchies of global linguistic power, how can we move beyond Jewish or even Israel-Palestine specific framings of power and language and understand how these local dynamics exist in conversation with global linguistic hierarchies? How can we, in our work, allow these multiple multilingualisms, these multiple systems of multilingual connections to exist in our same analytical space? So thank you, all of you, for your presentations.
Since we don't have enough time, maybe we'll collect some questions as well from the audience.
But we really don't have time. How much time do you want to take, actually?
Let's take another 10 minutes.
Okay, great. So I'll just stand here and field questions, but why don't we take a few? Hold on a sec. Okay, so I have Vital, Rachel. Anyone else for this first go around? Okay, go ahead, Vital.
Thanks everybody for the papers. I have a question for Alex. So the poem that you read in response to the Lebanon War was so simplistic and propagandistic and really like devoid of any artistic value that it led me to wonder two things. One is, were there actually any good, works produced in that period? Like what sort of occasion, what led you to select this example, which was a very weak example in terms of its aesthetic value, to kind of explain the dynamics of the Russian ultra-Zionist, propagandistic literature in this period? Was there anything that was actually worth reading at this time? And also, was there any kind of criticism from within the Russian community? Obviously, there are people there who really appreciate good literature. Wasn't anybody sort of responding to the fact that where was it published? I'm just curious about, sort of the divide between propaganda and so-called high literature, just sort of the politics of the reception and how people understood it in the community.
All right, so let's take Rachel's question and then you guys can answer.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for a fascinating panel. It was really interesting to see how all of the figures that you're discussing sort of exist on this continuum of multilingualism as either subversive or marginal. It was really kind of interesting to see that, and we were able to do that. I was also really Actually, just two questions. One is for Alex, who sort of brought us up until the present, or almost the present, and that was sort of your end point. And I'm wondering if you could take us a little bit further and tell us something about Rackham Israeli literature today, and in particular, if you see any kind of a transnational network emerging of Jewish writers from the former Soviet Union writing not only in Israel, but also in the United States and in Germany. And in those contexts, some of them are switching to the language of the new country, right? So I'm just wondering if you can comment on that. And then the other question is for Adriana. Well, actually, two questions. One, I was just wondering how Yael is written in Hebrew. And I was also just wondering about this relationship between Shimel and Amichai, because I found it really interesting that you mentioned this chapbook that Amichai helped translate into Hebrew, and I think around the same time, Shimel was translating Amichai into English, and that's really what sets him into orbit, right, as you put it, with the help, of course, of Gutmann and Ted Hughes. And I just recently learned that Asya Gutmann put her head in an oven like Sylvia's lap, thanks to Ted Hughes. So anyway, that's kind of apparently there's a whole network there, and it's just interesting that we have, since you commented on Shimel kind of going in the wrong direction, and you have an assisting Amichai going in the right direction, so to speak, right, from Hebrew into English. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on that relationship, particularly because Shimel was a translator, right, so he was involved in this.
Oh, is there one more question? Yes, so Naomi, why don't we add your question?
Thank you.
Sorry.
Throw out a question that I was trying to formulate in my head. So, Adriana, when you started, it was really interesting because you started, if I'm remembering correctly, by putting Shimel in sort of an American context as an English writing poet. And you know, it really strikes me how so many of the texts that you've looked at, certainly the English, the Russian, and the Yiddish ones, can be seen from these different perspectives, right? For the most part, you've all focused on them, and it makes sense for our topic today, in the Israeli context. Now, what happens if we flip it, right? And so, Adriana, I think you gestured towards that already in terms of looking at Shimel in an English-speaking context. But what happens if we sort of rotate the perspective here on the Israeli Russian writers or on the Israeli Yiddish writers? Does it change how we view their work and also their positionality within sort of cultural spheres?
Go ahead. Who wants to start? I'm happy to start because I can do it quickly. Okay. Well, Loel is Lamed Vav. I actually have a photocopied version of the book. It's really hard to find. I think Peter Cole was right. It did not sell very well, and it's vanished. So if you want to look at it, I photocopied the whole thing. And finally, yeah, I'm actually working on an article on the Shimel-Amichai relationship. It's interesting because when Amichai says sent into orbit, he's actually referring to Ted Hughes. So that whole relationship was also vexed with sort of status issues and status anxiety. So Shimel was initially kind of one of these early translators of Amichai, who then gets, he's a little undermined by Ted Hughes. Ted Hughes sort of steps in. He's the bigger name poet. He brings in his lover, Asya Gutmann, to translate, and they sort of take over. And throughout, Shimel keeps trying to sort of insert himself. And then it's clear from some letters that I found between Shimel and an American publisher that he was sort of leveraging his translations of Amichai into the opportunity of publishing his own work in English. So there's a lot of stuff going on. Also, Amichai was more than happy to be translated, but he was more reluctant to expend his energies on translating his friends. So there's also all these transactional issues here. For Shimel, and even for Hughes to some extent, Hughes really wanted to be translated into Hebrew. There is this expectation that they'll give something back, and it doesn't quite work out that way. But that's a longer conversation. And then to Naomi's question, I think it is important to flip the focus. That's something that I gestured towards the end, because also when I was working on my book, only towards the end did I start thinking like we could really look at this from other directions. Schimmel, for example, is gaining some sort of traction now in contemporary American poetry, partly through the work of young scholar and translator Ariel Reznikov, who's been translating him into English and has been reintroducing him to sort of the New York poetry scene. So he's taking on sort of this new life in English translation and finding readers there. So I find that really interesting as well. But I'll pass it on now to Alex.
Okay, thank you for your comment and for your questions. So first of all, I'll take Lital's question, propaganda poetry, and why I chose Michael Hobman. Well, maybe I didn't contextualize him enough, but Michael Hobman is very, very well-known Russian both writer and painter, who he's primarily he calls himself the second avant-garde. He sees himself as a descendant of Mayakovsky. And propaganda for him is not a bad word. This is precisely what he is trying to do, his political project. So yes, perhaps the aesthetic quality is not very high, I agree. But there are also poets like Mikhail Gendelev, who I wanted to bring here as well, whose aesthetic quality is very high, but pretty much the content of the poetry is the same. There is one poem, it's called Towards Arab Speech, and it rewrites Mandelstam, speaking of Mandelstam, and the Mandelstam has one poem about the Russian humanist tradition of literature, and pretty much he rewrites it that this Russian humanist tradition is impossible when dealing with Arabs about poetry. So I think the poetry that I chose representative of the larger community during the 70s and nowadays, because the right wing is, as you know, it's pretty high among the Russian community in Israel. Where was it published? It was published in War Notebooks that Mikhail Gendelev wrote himself. He's also editor of Zerkala magazine that Adriana, you know, Zerkala journal. That has been published for the last 35 years. Again, it is experimental literary magazine, even though that doesn't seem too experimental. I agree. About Russophone literature today and the transnational connection, I find this question fascinating, and this is what I work on in my dissertation. One of the most surprising things to note about Russian literature in Israel is its reluctance to switch into Hebrew. Clearly, global Russian literature is happening nowadays, and the writers are in contact with many other locations. I did digital humanities project when I took 4 literary journals in Israel, and I identified where the authors are located. So I put them on a map, the whole 1,000-something writers, and you see the spread, the geographical spread of the global literature is happening. But the question, why did they not switch into Hebrew, is interesting, because you see Gerlich-Steingart phenomenon in United States, you see Wismowskis in Canada, you see Kaminer in Germany. Those are extremely popular writers. So who do we have in Israel? Alona Kimchi and Alex Epstein, who are great writers, but let's say they're not as well known and iconic, Berli Zeidman as well. But they're not as iconic. So I think this brings me to Liora's question about the status of Hebrew, as what are the Russian writer who has come from a tradition of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, which they quite remind again and again about that. The switch into Hebrew shrinks your market possibilities. And when Dina Rubina, a popular Israeli Russian writer, when she's been published in Moscow, she published more than 20 books, and her books come in huge print runs of about 500,000 to 1 million copies every book that she sells. This is clearly impossible in the Israeli context. So there's also a condescension toward looking down on Israeli culture and not wanting to switch, and at the same time, money-wise, it just makes sense. So I think this is why they're not switching. This is my theory. Thank you.
I just want to mention, since Alex, you brought the 1 million readers of Russian literature outside Israel, that for the Yiddish writers, it was also transnational. I mean, the readers were not necessarily in Israel; they were all over the world, but they were shrinking. So, if before the Holocaust there could have been millions, and there were millions of Yiddish readers, after the Holocaust it was going down. But they were very much in dialogue also with Yiddish writers in America and in Europe. That's one thing. The other thing is that Liora, with your comments about the kind of loss of Jewishness when coming to Israel, that was very strong. I mean, and also the issue of Zionism, whether writing in Yiddish is inherently subversive or anti-Zionism, it's not clear. Maybe it's not kind of the propaganda poetry that the Russian writers wrote in the 70s, but for Sutzkever, when he wrote this Yiddish, Den Feierwogen, it was celebration of Zionism, but insistence that Zionism, that being Zionist and being in Israel doesn't necessarily mean the erasure of Yiddish, and he points out to the fact that Yiddish existed in Palestine before. For Bergner, he said, I came to Israel as a Jew, not as a Zionist, right? So that's maybe a little more oppositional force. And the other thing I wanted to mention with Yael is actually this whole question of what happens when you move later to a period where these people, like, Mizrahim came from Arabic-speaking background, but they no longer know Arabic, right? And also with Ashkenazim who no longer know Yiddish, but then there's this whole kind of post-vernacular phenomena that people are trying to learn the language, and here they don't have to be Ashkenazim. There's also Mizrahim who's studying Yiddish because of all kind of political reasons, right? So there's kind of interesting phenomena that happens if you think about people like Almog Behar and Sami Shitrit, and people like, Moshe Sakal, who studies who is related to Ho, and studying Yiddish as a kind of a way to connect to this modernist tradition, and maybe also as a political act. That's interesting to think about.
Yeah, and I just think bringing Arabic into this discussion as well, or at least as it is in these poems, it's important to note again that the poems that I worked on by the two Jewish Israeli writers are Hebrew poems that make some gestures towards Arabic and towards a Palestinian poet, but are Hebrew poems. And that brings up, among other things, the question of who is their audience, who is their intended audience. They don't have necessarily an Arabic-speaking audience, not within Israel, either Jews or Palestinians, but I don't think that they necessarily do outside of Israel in the very large Arabic-speaking world. And I think that in a sense puts them in a different position than maybe the other poems or other texts on this panel. And that, of course, is related to the question of power, which, as Liora said, is very central to my paper. And I think that your point, Liora, is very, very well taken, that multilingualism does not guarantee subversion, as the papers on this panel have shown in different ways. And that is extremely, I'm going to need to make many notes of that, because that is an assumption that is actually very, very dangerous. Multilingualism or using more than one language maybe can be a starting point, but to think that then we can just celebrate ourselves and say, oh, we speak more than one language, therefore we have subverted whatever hegemony we think we have is a real political problem, and it has to be something more than that. It has to be an address, and I think that came up in a lot of these papers, an address to some other as other, and not as a means to whatever end is in fact our own end.
Great. All right, well, thank you to everybody on this panel. I think we have lunch, is that right?
Yeah, we have lunch now, and lunch is in the other room. I can't remember the name, the West Conference Room, I think. And we're going to convene here again at 1:30 to the second session between original and translation, rewriting Israeli literature. So don't go anywhere.